I want to welcome everyone. This is the Vision Zero Cleveland Safe, Sustainable Transportation Vision Zero Cleveland Safe, Sustainable Streets for All breakout group. And we are welcomed by, or we are joined by, Anne, I'm sorry, we were joined by Anne Tillie, who just got kicked off. I apologize about that. And maybe if you just refresh, hopefully that will bring you back. And let's see here. Yeah, so Anne Tillie is the Research and Policy Analyst for Cleveland City Council. Matt, welcome back, sorry about that. Matt Moss is one of our city planners in our city planning department. And then we've got Rob Mavec here, who is with our traffic engineering department at the City of Cleveland. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne, who is going to be giving you an overview of the Vision Zero task force in Cleveland, work that they've been doing over the last couple of years. Matt's going to give an overview of the crash statistic data. I hope I got that right. A dashboard that he's been working on, looks like a pretty cool tool. And then Rob Mavec is going to talk about some of the investments and things that the city does to really make sure that we are ensuring that we have safe streets for our residents. So with that, I will turn it over to Anne, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Kristen. Give me a minute here to pull up those slides. But like I said, my name is Anne Tillie. I'm a policy researcher for Cleveland City Council, and I help co-manage the Vision Zero Cleveland program. I hope everyone can see this. And if you want to explode this screen, I think you can double click it to kind of zoom that out. Also, you can hide the chat. That will help make it pretty visible on the screen. Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. So Vision Zero Cleveland is a traffic safety initiative that was undertaken by the city, started about almost 3 years ago now, January of 2018. And so, you know, this work really came about led by both the administration with Chief Darnell Brown and Councilman Matt Zone. And this came after we learned every week 6 Clevelanders are seriously injured in traffic crashes, and every year about 37 Clevelanders lose their lives to traffic crashes. And so I did want to take a minute to kind of recognize what that looks like in 2020. You know, as of September, we have lost about 50 people on our roads to traffic crashes, which is a horrible number, quite frankly. You know, we know that traffic crashes don't have to happen. You know, they're not unavoidable, and there are things we can do to change that. And so we'll get into that a little bit more, but I wanted to take a minute to recognize those that we've lost. So Matt's going to get into this a little more, so I won't touch on this too much. But, you know, we've been able to look at the crash data and figure out, you know, where are crashes happening, and this populates what we call the high injury network. So you can kind of see here, you know, the black lines indicate roughly where 1/3 of our serious injuries and fatalities happen. And then the red lines are more specifically, you know, on those roads, where are they most concentrated? So, you know, we can see from this map that most of our crashes happen on our widest and fastest streets. And that's kind of by design. So to combat this, you know, we really look at Vision Zero as this strategy to eliminate all traffic fatalities and serious injuries while increasing safe, healthy, equitable mobility for all. So Vision Zero was a program that was started in Sweden in the 90s, and now it is a program that is more than 30 cities. So in Cleveland, you know, we put this into 5. Our work is made up of 5 main subcommittees. So that's design and engineering, enforcement, which we recognize as a very evolving group, data and evaluation, education and engagement, and fleet and vehicle maintenance. So all of these kind of work together to make our streets safer, and their disciplines But more specifically, we look at safe travel for all, and we group this into 4 main categories. So safe streets, safe vehicles, and safe people. So I'll touch briefly before we move on. Rob and Matt will perhaps talk a little bit more about this, but safe streets of how are streets designed? Are they designed in a way that encourages speeding? Are they designed in a way that makes it difficult for people to cross the street if they're not in a vehicle? We also look at safe speeds, because we know speed kills. If speed affects when you're driving your cone of vision, what you are able to see in your peripheral, it affects how fast you can stop if you need to stop. It also affects the likeliness of whether you live or die if you strike a vulnerable road user like a cyclist or a pedestrian. So speed management is one of those large components that we look at. We also look at safe vehicles, so making sure that if someone is right hooked, or a vehicle makes a right turn and strikes a vulnerable road user, they're not going to get swept up under the vehicle. We know the technology is emerging about in our vehicle, personal vehicles, that detect crash senses, they detect slowdowns or other safety hazards. But we also want to look at, public transit is arguably one of the safest modes of traffic, and that's been supported by a lot of research, less likely to be in a dangerous crash. And lastly, we look at safe people. So a lot of the things that we do with Vision Zero are design based. They affect the way people drive, but we also know some of these issues are behavioral too, right? So, we want to make sure that people are wearing their seatbelts. People aren't texting and driving, not distracted or driving when they're inebriated. So kind of putting these all together, we know that, making our roads safer is a shared responsibility. So that's how we put together safe travel for all. So that, looking at that, the city has signed on to bring on a consultant and help us write an action plan. So they'll kind of take some of these strategies and put it into real action. So as a very broad overview of what are we hoping to get out of that action plan, first and foremost, we hope to set a deadline for eliminating those deaths and serious injuries. So that might look like, for example, by 2035, the city of Cleveland will not have any deaths or serious injuries. And we also hope to take that deadline and assign responsibility and funding. This department will take this action by this date. So we also hope to get a better understanding of our crash patterns. So taking a really deep dive at that high injury network, some of our other crash data, and also the policies we implement around transportation. So we want to be able to look at that data, look at that crash pattern, and then create a replicable template that we can address all crashes. We also hope to create a policy to better realign our investments to eliminate serious crashes and injuries. A lot of times, and then historically, we've looked at, our investments of, we prioritize convenience, level of service, but, how can we really shift those investments to reflect safety? And then lastly, we really hope to set up a process, community culture to facilitate systemic change. We know Vision Zero doesn't mean much to a lot of people, but it is a very large shift in thinking about, traffic deaths being inevitable versus we can prevent traffic deaths. It's expensive to make our roads safer. It's not really that expensive to make our roads safer when we think about the broader implications. So, the action plan is going to be about a year-long process, and that should be kicking off hopefully later this month. But, this is really how we're going to be able to take this idea and shift it into action. So I'll stop there. And then I want to kick it over to Matt, who can talk a little bit more about the data. He's got a great dashboard to show us about, what do we know about crashes and where are they happening? So I'm going to come back and unshare my screen. And I'll turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Anne. Great overview. As Anne mentioned, and what I want to emphasize is when we first started figuring out how we were going to develop not only an action plan, but actually tackle and accomplish the goal of zero traffic deaths and serious injuries on our streets, we worked with the Vision Zero network to come up with a strategy to do that. And one thing we kept consistently hearing from the network and from other people who would work on Vision Zero projects across the country is that the data is really important, and that's the best place to start. And so what we've done through one of the subcommittees that Anne mentioned is look at the crash data that we have available through ODOT. And so ODOT does a pretty excellent job of making crash data available statewide to cities and to staff like ourselves in terms of in order to analyze it and observe trends. And so what we have here, and this is a prototype for now, but what we're working on doing with the task force and through the data and evaluation subcommittee specifically is to put our crashes onto a map and figure out what type of geographic relationships are happening and also what type of crash relationships are happening. So we get information on crashes that break down into certain emphasis areas. So things like whether it's a crash related to alcohol consumption or a crash related to speeding or crashes in intersections. And so one thing we're starting to do is to break these crashes down into digestible parts. And one way we do it is in a way that we understand, for example, the power dynamics and how they work in the city of Cleveland. And so one analysis we're doing now is working with ward council people to understand exactly what's happening in their wards and how they can address some of the crash trends that are occurring. And so this dashboard takes crash data and allows you to select certain wards and filter the high-level statistics and some even more specific statistics in terms of crash type. So each ward selection will tell you how many fatalities have occurred, how many serious injuries, how many of those crashes are pedestrian, and how many are speed related. It also gives you the breakdown by year in terms of which crashes resulted in a fatality and which crashes resulted in a serious injury. And then finally, there's a chart here that shows the crash type. You can also adjust this to make it more or less visible in terms of what the information is telling you. So you can see, for example, in Ward 11, most crashes occurred at an angle. And the second most common type of crash was a crash involving a pedestrian. But that information changes depending on where you go in the city. So in Ward 14, for example, the most common factor was a crash with a fixed object. So that would be something like a tree, a telephone pole, or unfortunately even a building sometimes. And so this is just our first attempt to figure out how we can start categorizing crashes that are occurring across the city in a way that we can break them down and, like Anne mentioned, assign them to a team in order to figure out how do we prevent these types of crashes in the future. And I think an important component of that is to also look at where crashes are occurring in the city, specifically on roadway segments. And so what we've done over the last few years is come up with a rolling profile of city streets. And so we've broken these down with the help of NOACA into high crash segments. So these are parts of the city where, specifically on roadways, where there are at least 10 fatal or serious crashes in a rolling 5-year period. So we started doing this analysis in 2018 using 2017 data. And that network is represented here. And what I can do is show you how that has changed over time. So these black lines represent crashes that have occurred, high crash segments using 2013 to 2017 data. In 2019, we updated it with 2018 data, and you can see here how some segments have been added. For example, Kinsman has added more segments, St. Clair as well. And most recently, in this year, we updated it with 2019 data. And so some segments fall off and some segments get added where crashes keep occurring or are occurring more frequently, unfortunately. And what this data is starting to do is to show us, okay, where are there consistently dangerous parts of not only specific, not just specific corridors, but specific parts of those corridors. And so this is the work we've been doing now, which we hope will inform the action plan in terms of focusing our efforts and coming up with not only solutions that are specific geographically, but specific to what exactly the conditions are going on those crashes. So we're able to filter the crashes that specifically occur on these corridors in these segments, read those reports and figure out what exactly is going on. The last component I wanted to share with you all is a tool that we've seen other cities adopt and try to utilize in some ways. What the main difference between the data you see on the dashboard, these dots here, these are actual crashes. So these are crashes where at least one motor vehicle is involved, and it's either hitting another car, hitting an object, or hitting a person on a bike or on their own 2 feet. And what we're unable to capture are incidences where there might not be an actual crash where a police officer is called to the scene or some other type of reporting agency, but it's a dangerous interaction. And so we've created, in partnership with White Cleveland, a database where users can go in and report close calls. They're also known as near misses. So we have this tool available to the public where you can, if you see a car run a stop sign, or maybe they stop too far out into the intersection into a crosswalk, and that creates a dangerous situation. So it's not something where a crime has been committed or a traffic violation occurred, but where there was a dangerous experience. And so we've had this out for a few months now, and we're already getting some data reports, but this is an attempt to fill in a gap between where we don't have a crash reported and a record of that, but there still might be dangerous behavior going on, and whether that's behavior by road users or intrinsic to the geometry of the intersection. And so this form is available in public, and I'm happy to share the link with you all today. But essentially, it just asks for some basic information, what type of road user you are, what direction you're traveling, what the offending vehicle type might be, and this can be any sort of user, whether it's a car, truck, bicycle, pedestrian, or a bus. And ask if you did file a police report, that there's a number you can put in there so we can follow up, and just a description of what's going on. You can also upload photo or video if there's ever a recording of anything that occurred. And then it also allows you to scroll down to the map here and place a pin to tell us exactly where that incident occurred. So this is a really useful tool, and it really is, I think, our attempt to try to cover all our bases in terms of how we understand safety and the perception of safety on our roadways. I'll turn it back over to Anne.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really glad you brought up the close call form, because, part of Vision Zero is we don't want to be reacting to crashes every time, that there's too much life to cost to work that way. So, hopefully using the near miss data, that helps us be a little bit more proactive in our approach. So thank you for sharing that. So now I want to turn it over to Commissioner Rob Mavec, who works in our traffic engineering department, to talk a little bit more about some of the things that the city has done and is already doing around Vision Zero that both makes our streets safer and more sustainable. We have this action plan rolling out, but that doesn't mean we have to wait a whole year to start making our streets safer. So Rob, whenever you're ready, you can tell us a little bit more about that. And you are on mute.
And I think for some reason, Rob might be having trouble hearing you. Rob, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Matt. For some reason, I didn't hear anything Anne had presented or just said. So I don't know if you need me to take over, or first, I don't know what the issue is, but I'm having.
Yeah, actually, I think we want we wanted to kick it over to you to talk about your experience both historically in Cleveland and then also working on the task force.
Okay. My name is Rob Mavec. I'm the Commissioner of Traffic Engineering at the City of Cleveland. And one of the roles that I've had with Vision Zero is being a co-chair with the Director of Planning, Freddie Collier. How that is, what the role and goals of our subcommittee is to really look at how do we implement a lot of the changes to our roadway networks that'll make it safer. And one of the things that we realized from the very get-go is we needed to engage our engineering department as projects get scoped, try to implement as many of these changes that are possible or that have been identified, whether it be through crash data and or public outreach. We've developed a system in order to get on the scoping committees of those projects well in advance of those projects being designed. Predating that, we've always looked at the roadway network from a safety perspective, but since Vision Zero was introduced, I believe it was in 2017, we've been really looking at different ways to treat the roadways. And I'm just going to give a couple examples of where we've implemented different types of traffic control devices throughout the city, where we've implemented bike lanes, and some other projects that are on the horizon here. So one thing that we always look at is the operations of traffic signals, or the operations of the roadway, how pedestrians interact, bicycles interact. So I guess two locations that I would point out are where we've implemented roundabouts, where we had a traditional traffic signal. Those two locations are Franklin and Fulton, and 116th and MLK. And what that does is reduce the interaction between vehicle, pedestrian, and bikes, where there's 32 points of conflict at a traffic light, whereas a roundabout there's 8. Generally, when there's a crash at a roundabout, it's a minor crash or a side swipe rather than an angle. Before, Matt had talked about a lot of the angle accidents, that those generally happen at traffic lights or unsignalized locations. In 2013, I'm trying jumping around. I don't present very well like the other two, so I'm better at answering questions. But in 2013, the mayor put together the Bikeway Master Plan, and since that point, every project has looked at bike infrastructure. That bike infrastructure, since that point, we've implemented over 90 miles worth of bike lanes, and moving forward, every project includes some sort of bike infrastructure and or improvements to pedestrian access. The most recent projects that we're working on for pedestrian safety involve a statewide initiative for pedestrian enhancements. And along those projects, we're adding bump outs and RFBs for high pedestrian points.
Commissioner Mavec, do we lose you? I'm seeing a mute button and no screen. Oh.
Just unmute, and I think we'll be back in. Commissioner, can you unmute yourself if you can hear us? And maybe while we wait for the commissioner to get kind of back in action, we could look at some questions from the audience. Are you able to see the chat, or I can read off a couple questions that we've received so far?
Yes, I can see the chat. I'll start with one of the first questions that was posed about, we see a lot of pedestrians perhaps walking in the street, even when there might be a sidewalk. And, why do we think this is? This is both concerning when you're driving, if someone is in that roadway, but also as a pedestrian, why are they there? We don't know exactly. So Matt, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that before I make a thought out of my head.
Go for it, Ann.
Okay, so, I will say, there always is that level of safety. Where do people feel safe in the roads? And, for some people on the sidewalk, it might not be a comfortable way to travel. If the sidewalk is very broken up, I think particularly about our folks that are maybe in a wheelchair or, who aren't quite as able to walk unless it's a smooth surface. So being in the roadway might be more comfortable. Or if it's just a patch of dirt, which is what we call perhaps a desire line. People want to walk there, but there aren't the facilities. One of the other things I think about of why pedestrians might be walking in the street, you know, some of our roads in Cleveland are what I know Councilman Griffin likes to refer to as super blocks. They're very long. And, you know, from block to block of when you do have that crosswalk is pretty far. And in my opinion, perhaps unreasonable to have to, you know, go so far to cross the street and get to your destination. So perhaps that could be a way, you know, a pedestrian might feel, you know, this is where I need to be to cross to where I need to go to, even if there's not a crosswalk there. But this is a safety concern. I understand as a driver, you know, that's not a predictable path necessarily for pedestrians. Matt, do you have any thoughts?
I would also add that we're exploring crash incidences that occur depending upon the time of year. And we are observing some trends, and we haven't done enough of a thorough analysis to understand if it really is a phenomenon occurring. But in the winter months, when sidewalks aren't cleared as regularly, and in the city of Cleveland, it's generally the responsibility of the property owner to maintain a clear sidewalk, as that's an easement in some cases over their property by the city. And when sidewalks are not maintained, especially if you're a road user that needs, or if you're a pedestrian that needs the assistance of a mobility device to get around, the roadway is cleared by the public, and we in Cleveland expect private property owners to maintain the sidewalks, and that imbalance is a power imbalance between pedestrians and motorists. But it's where we as a society have decided to divert our resources, and I think that that's one reason why we're seeing higher pedestrian crashes, where pedestrians are struck in the roadway by other road users, because the road is free of ice and free of snow, and that's not a service we provide on the sidewalks.
Yeah, Matt, I think that really emphasizes, you know, the point earlier we mentioned about Vision Zero. It really is a shared responsibility to keep all of our road users safe. So I did want to bounce. I see another question from Josh about, you know, in the pandemic, we've really seen a need for increased recreational spaces, you know, not only of, you know, to get out on your bike, because you want the fresh air, but, you know, as we travel on our sidewalks, not all of our sidewalks can really accommodate that social distance. So, you know, what can the city do? You know, given that we have reduced traffic, we might not need all the travel lanes we currently have. You know, how do we balance, you know, the traffic we have and then the needs we see given the pandemic and our recreational needs, as well as just general travel needs? So Matt, I don't know if you want to take that, or Rob. I see Rob's back with us. I don't know if he caught that question.
I apologize. I did miss the question. I had to log out and log back in. I think everything's working better now.
Hey, yeah, Rob, maybe this is a good question for you. We got a question in the chat about, at least during the pandemic and then in other situations, temporary or short-term interventions to pilot added bike infrastructure, for example, on city streets, or other forms of interventions or modifications to the roadway, whether it's to create space for bikes or for pedestrians. Do you think you could speak about some of the pilot initiatives or any roadway innovations that your office has undertaken or is interested in exploring?
Commissioner, you're on mute.
As it relates to the bike infrastructure, we have not piloted anything at this point. What we have done is the city has put out the expanded outdoor seating areas. So on many of their main streets, West 25th, some of the ones in the downtown area, we've actually taken the parking lanes, in some cases, some of the driving lanes, and created an extended patio seating for some of the restaurants. We've also had a lot of traffic counts have been performed during the initial shutdowns and subsequently a few months later, and found that the traffic hadn't necessarily decreased dramatically in a lot of our main streets, just based on our traffic counts. It was reduced, but not significantly.
You know, that idea of data is important, you know, of what are we actually seeing versus what is anecdotal evidence. But, you know, I also want to emphasize looking at, you know, how do we serve these spaces? I think it's really important that we talk to the community and involve the community of, you know, what, you know, not necessarily what would you like to see, but what needs do you have? You know, how are you using your roads? You know, this can't just be something the city plops down on the roads and says, here it is. You know, we want this to be a process that is involved and engaged. So Matt, you looked like you might have had something to add.
I'm just reading more questions in the chat.
So yeah, that is thanks, Matt. You know, but it is an involving question of, you know, how do we use our spaces to better suit our needs? You know, very early on in the pandemic, we didn't know how long it was going to last. You know, we didn't know if traffic would come back in 2 months or 6 months or never. So I would say that is an evolving process that we try to monitor as we go forward. You know, perhaps get a better idea of what we think is going to happen in the future and what our future needs might be. So, oh, there are a lot of questions, so forgive me if I'm reading.
I can answer Isaac's question if you'd like, Anne.
Yeah, go ahead.
Isaac, we just started comparing the high crash segments and some of the crash data we have now to pavement condition reports. So we are working, the city is, I think, fairly rapidly moving towards adopting or migrating our data to the same GIS platform that I use to create the crash dashboard. And so I am starting to compare crash data and the high crash segments to our pavement condition reports. But I don't believe that data includes sidewalk condition. I think that's only roadway surface condition. Unfortunately, and this is I think an interesting balance for a city like Cleveland to consider is right now one of our hypotheses is that when we redo road surfaces and improve them and make roadway surfaces smoother, people drive faster, and we know that that's a risk factor in whether a crash results in a serious injury or a fatality. And so that's an interesting balance, right? And sometimes, you know, even in my work, we hear from residents who sometimes don't want their roadways improved because they know people will drive faster. So that's an interesting balance. But if there's a data source for pavement or for sidewalk condition that is consistent and available, I think it's an analysis we would be able to do very easily to understand not only where that higher crashes are occurring based on pavement condition, but we can even filter crashes where there was a pedestrian in the roadway and use that to compare to pavement condition to see if there's a relationship there. So we have lots of opportunities, just need more data, more connection between data sources within the city and within our region to really understand if those relationships exist.
Yeah, Matt, I think you bring up a great point. You know, in our data, and you know, Matt Moss and Brian Blaney from NOACA do excellent work with our data, kind of overlaying in the GIS software. You know, we not only just look at like pavement conditions, you know, the actual roads, you know, all of this is a wide road, but we also look at things like, you know, and Matt, forgive me if I butcher these terms, I'm not a planner, but you know, what is the land use? You know, how wide are our roads? What are they, you know, what is the speed limit on our roads? So, you know, we can kind of layer all that data to give us a really good picture of, you know, what are the conditions on this road and how might they be contributing to crash patterns. It's a lot of data to collect. We're probably, you know, we probably still have a lot more to collect. We're hoping to get that soon, but all those things add up and paint a really good picture. So I would anticipate in the future, that's kind of where our data and evaluation subcommittee is headed.
Yeah, land uses and comparing land use along corridors and specifically the high crash segments is something I'm really interested in, because I think it's a long-term issue with long-term effects on how people operate on our roadways, whether again it's in a car, a bike, or on feet. I think the next question would be good for Rob. Rob, we have a question in the chat about universally reducing speed limits. So Brian asks, is consideration given to universally reducing speed limits by say 5 miles per hour across the city streets, arterial collectors, and residentials? Could you maybe speak to the speed limit reduction process in the city of Cleveland, or how we can go about that, or how we're constrained perhaps in doing that?
Yeah. Rob, you're on mute when you're ready. Oh, perfect. Go ahead.
That's a question that we get asked all the time. We're asked to reduce speed limits throughout the city. we have to follow the Ohio Revised Code, which sets speed limits based on land use and a 85th percentile. If it was up to me, every time we got a request to reduce the speed limit, I would just reduce it because it would reduce my headaches. However, just a brief history lesson from the city of Cleveland. In 2003, we had a class action lawsuit where a lot of our speed limits were illegally posted, where they were not really enforceable, even though tickets had been issued. So the city had to reimburse all those all those folks that got tickets because the speed limits were incorrect. The way to change that is to change Ohio law, which would change the statutory speeds on many of our roadways. So for instance, anything that's a through highway or a state highway, and that means that's a continuous street for over 1 mile, that is residential in nature, that's 35. If it's a business district or a commercial district, it's 25. Seems counterintuitive, but that's how that law is actually written. So we try to follow that, but that's a question that we get quite often. And my answer in general is, well, we'll do the traffic study to see if we can reduce it legally. And if not, it's a matter of changing state law.
Thanks, Rob. That's a really great point. I don't think that is particularly well known. There are a lot of roads in our network that are not under City of Cleveland jurisdiction. So we don't really have that authority. I would say, as a task force, we've connected with ODOT, District 12 to kind of figure out, well, what is the solution? How can we get that authority without making it this mundane process? But I would like to emphasize again, we can sign our streets to a speed we want, but if they're not designed to the speed that we would like to see, it only does so much. I think anyone that's driven on the Shoreway on the west side, that's signed at 35, but if you go 35, people pass you like you're standing still. So it's important that we not only sign our streets appropriately, but we design them too. So I do, I'm thinking about, this is a sustainability summit, and Vision Zero, of course, is an important transportation policy, but I think it's always undervalued as like a sustainability tool. And so, Rob mentioned earlier, the city's done a lot with bike lanes and kind of accommodating more of our vulnerable road users. And that big idea of mode shift, that is really important to sustainability. The more people we can get out of single occupancy vehicles and into alternative modes of transportation, that does a lot for greenhouse gas emissions, our climate. But Matt and Rob, I kind of want to talk about what are perhaps maybe the more, like, I don't want to say secret, but the less or the more subtle ways that Vision Zero advances sustainability. One of the things that comes to my head is the city's putting in all these LED lights, which are more energy efficient, but making sure our roadways are well lit, and then when lights do go out, we can approach and fix them. So visibility is important to transportation safety. So I don't know if either of you would want to perhaps speak a little bit more about that. How are Vision Zero and sustainability kind of dovetailing?
And I'll take a quick stab at that, just from the perspective of our own division. In the city of Cleveland, we have roughly 1,000 traffic signals, which equates to 35,000 bulbs. Since 2002, we've been upgrading and changing those all out to LED. So whereas our power consumption historically had been $300,000 to $400,000 a year, we've reduced that down to about 80,000 once we have everything metered. The other important point of the LED light change out for our traffic lights is there's a threshold. So if our voltage coming into the light goes below 90 volts, it'll put the light automatically into flash. Because the LEDs only draw 7 amps versus 50, it actually, our lights never really go into flash because of the power fluctuation. So it's made it a lot safer and has reduced our costs significantly as it relates to energy consumption. And I know CPP has just begun their LED light change out, and it is a significant improvement to the actual lumens on the street. I don't know if Matt wants to jump in on that as well.
Yeah, I think I mean, I didn't know that, Rob, so that's really great information to share. And I didn't realize until you just said it, the connection between how the signals operate and versus the power they consume. And so that's really fascinating. One thing we have the data to do, we have not done the analysis yet, is compare the LED conversions for streetlights to crashes that in the crash report form have indicated visibility as a factor. And that's an analysis I'd really love to do. And we'll certainly try to find the time to do, because it would have been great to have it for this session. But there's so much data we have right now that it's been difficult to parse it all. But that's an analysis that I think would be really would be illuminating in that sense, right? To see where crashes that have visibility as a factor in that crash, and it's probably too early to tell if those LED replacements have reduced those crashes. But that's something that we can, if we set up the infrastructure now in terms of the policies and the people to collect that data and analyze it, we can see if those trends are occurring. And really, the time is now to set that up, right? To figure out who has the data, how do we get that data, how do we parse that data, how do we analyze that data, and then how do we publish that data? That's, I think, the primary task we have from a data standpoint through the task force and through the action plan that we want to start very soon.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. As you guys can all tell in this presentation, data is really important to Vision Zero, in targeting our response and determining, areas of great need. And Rob, I did not know that about the traffic lights either, of how they operate. So that learned something new today. So perhaps kind of hinging on this idea of sustainability in Vision Zero, perhaps we can talk about, I think one of the bigger topics in Cleveland is our tree canopy. We used to be the forest city. Tree canopy is perhaps declining, but we're trying to bring that back. How can, Matt or Rob, how can tree canopy on our roads, how can that affect Vision Zero? Or perhaps I'll start off. Our landscaping can really affect the speed at which our roads feel safe to operate. I know if you are going through Bracknell, it feels like a slower street because there's so much tree canopy. A lot of greenery that makes it feel residential, feel like you should slow down, but that doesn't necessarily exist everywhere. So would anyone like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, from my perspective, and trees have a lot of benefits beyond road safety, but to me, they fit into a category of active use along the street. And we have data and studies from other cities and other parts of the world that show that the more you strip away from the roadway, the less activity you have on the roadway. And activity, I mean it in the broadest sense in terms of just presence. The fewer things there are closer to the roadway, the easier it is to travel quickly. And drivers tend to lose focus on what's immediately around them if there isn't anything around them, and they travel at faster speeds. And that's sort of a vicious circle that just feeds upon itself, that encourages people to drive faster. And it's not even in many ways, it's not even a conscious action. It's just how people respond to, it's how we understand humans respond to their built environment. And so trees have different and significant benefits beyond buildings. But to me, it boils down to what is the land use along our corridors and streets, and the less of anything there is around, whether it's trees or other things, the more that we see that as a contributing factor to speeding, which is itself, like we mentioned, a contributing factor to whether a crash is severe or fatal. And I want to take that opportunity to remind everyone that our goal isn't necessarily to eliminate all traffic crashes. We understand that we'll never eliminate all crashes that occur as long as people are driving cars. We just want to ensure that if a crash does occur, it's not a crash that kills someone or puts someone in the hospital. And that's, I think, important to understand. I don't think we believe we'll eliminate all traffic crashes. We just want to make sure that the crashes that do occur people can walk away from and return to their families and return to their lives without being severely debilitated or killed.
Thanks, Matt. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is kind of, a shift of thinking that comes with Vision Zero, of, controlling the most severe crashes. So thank you for bringing that up. Perhaps we can pivot back. I've been seeing a couple more questions coming up in the chat. I think this question about, do we know the cost associated with replacement of utility poles, bus shelters that have been damaged? I know last week's Six Shooter Coffee up in Waterloo Arts District had another car go through their building. I feel so bad for them. So I don't know if we necessarily have that cost. That's a pretty tough cost, I think, to account for. But, I personally would love to know the cost of how much does it cost each month for, someone who's hit and receives a traumatic brain injury? How much does it cost them in the hospital? How much does it cost not only our healthcare industry, perhaps our economic, side of things, of if people don't feel safe traveling and walking to businesses? I don't have an answer for that. I think that data is really hard to capture, but Rob or Matt, if you want to weigh in.
And
I think Jacob mentioned it. Go ahead, Rob.
As it relates to costs for some of these crashes that were just mentioned, like a utility pole, it's not uncommon for us to have our control boxes hit regularly and or for our poles to be hit. So let's say a driver crashes into one of our mast arm poles and it falls into the street, which is not uncommon. That's about a $15,000 cost after all the labor and new poles considered. Our control boxes are roughly $6,000. Often we can't reclaim those costs because of the lack of insurance and whatnot, but it is a significant cost. Even when folks knock over our stop signs, the channel posts. So it is a significant cost to the city. And to Ann's point, based on these crashes, what are the hospital bills? Those are probably more substantial than the poles cost. So just a general cost for poles being hit.
Well, Rob, I so appreciate your institutional knowledge. You're just dropping all these facts today. I didn't realize it was that expensive, and that is a big cost for the city, as well as other costs associated, perhaps on the periphery of those crashes. Alrighty. So I see. Oh yeah, of course. Go ahead.
One of the nice things about Vision Zero, I'm gonna throw my phone off real quick, is we're talking, from my perspective, it's all about a traffic engineering perspective. Matt is really looking at the data, and the beauty of this is we can bring together, enforcement, data collection, the engineering portion of it, engagement and outreach. Because once you start really evaluating the data, which is now it's in one location, so we don't have to go searching for it. It's all housed within Vision Zero. We can then collaborate with the different groups within Vision Zero to try to correct some of the things that are happening. So for instance, if I collect data about crashes and we do speed counts and see that there's a speeding issue, it's pretty simple for me to send that over to the police department for maybe some additional enforcement, and or to the outreach group to talk about those things. Whereas before it was always, well, yeah, there's a crash issue, there's a speeding issue, we know that, we could maybe look at doing this, we can look at doing that. And it was more of a singular approach rather than a group effort to try to change maybe either the behavior and or the streetscape.
Yeah, I think I want to build off of what Rob said in terms of how we're trying to connect that data and those resources to the public. One of the ways we do that is with is with sessions like this, but we're working specifically in the planning department. The work that we touch upon is development of private land in the private realm, and then improvements in the public realm. And so part of our Vision Zero effort, in addition to to really explain, I think, what this data will do in terms of what impact it'll have, not just on internal city processes, but on the day-to-day lives of you all who either live or experience the built environment in Cleveland, is to figure out how we can better elevate awareness of these issues in terms of those processes when they occur in the public, right? When we have public meetings about roadway improvements, when we have public meetings about private development. One of the largest goals of Vision Zero, and a huge goal, a huge task for our action plan, is to figure out how we can better connect the goals and actions of Vision Zero to the day-to-day processes we do internally and externally in City Hall. And so that's participating in public meetings when it comes to capital improvements, but also I think what has been understated that I want to overstate perhaps is the importance of private development in addressing and advancing the goals of Vision Zero. There's huge, the high crash segments we have in the city of Cleveland, they're on some of the emptiest, underutilized land corridors in the city of Cleveland, and we're not going to be able to reverse that immediately, but encouraging sustainable development patterns that are not only energy efficient, of course, but sustainable in the sense that they encourage and in some ways require transportation and access that are in ways that don't involve a car, or at least don't rely on a car. And that's not only important from in terms of addressing our emissions in Cleveland and in the country and across the world, but also ensuring that those trips are safe. Cars are inherently unsafe mode of transportation. That's what the data tells us. And the only way long-term we can at least create the option for people to not have to drive is to build our city in a way that you don't need to get around in a car. And that's not something we're going to do tomorrow. It's not something we're going to accomplish next year. It has to be done with sustained effort. And the only way Cleveland can do that now is with support from residents along these corridors and in these neighborhoods, supporting development of vacant land, supporting the redevelopment of parking lots in neighborhoods where I work, for example, like Ohio City and Tremont, but also neighborhoods like Hartford and neighborhoods on the east side. These are things that need to be done now, and they're going to have to be incremental. And we have to measure that progress incrementally. It won't be something we can measure by saying, oh, great, we cut our traffic deaths in half because we've built on X number of vacant square feet. It's not going to work that way, but it has to be done incrementally, and I think understood incrementally if we really want this to change.
Right. I think that's a great point, Matt, of, we really can't afford to operate in silos anymore. This really has to be a coordinated effort. I know through this action planning process, we are going to do our darndest to make sure we are reaching out to the community and hearing them and, hearing about their concerns. But it is a broader conversation. And, I mentioned earlier, this is a one-year action planning process, but this is a very long-term goal. We may set a deadline that is in 15 years. So that's this long sustained effort working collaboratively. So I appreciate you pointing that out. So I see we have about 5 minutes left. And I realize we've done a lot of talking, and I know typically at the Sustainability Summit, there's a lot of dialogue. And I so wish we could all be together to talk about this, because I think great ideas come out when we're all together. So maybe I'll ask everyone in the chat box, try and make this a little bit more interactive. As we look at Vision Zero and sustainability, again, we talk about mode shift. How do we shift, the way we travel in a way that is more sustainable? So I would love to hear in the chat box, what is preventing you from perhaps making a shift? And I want to emphasize, I'm not asking you to sell your car and make all your trips by foot, but what is it prohibiting you from maybe taking an extra couple trips a week? I think that's an interesting place to start in terms of Vision Zero and sustainability. So hopefully those chat box will start filling up. But I know for me personally, I'm very fortunate that I live close to where I work and to where I shop and to where I play. But I know it is really difficult. Like if I want to get out to Costco, that's a that's a pretty far trip, has to be done by car. So that is, you know, maybe a limitation. Matt or Rob, perhaps you want to chime in? Or if this is a question that falls flat, that is okay too.
Well, Ann, I think where we're heading is, as it relates to the transit and maybe other modes, is we are finishing and update and upgrade our bicycle infrastructure. You know, I think we point to things like the Midway and Lorraine Avenue. As it relates, you know, to the transit, we've built the Euclid corridor. There was the Clifton BRT. They're now studying the West 25th Street as a priority corridor for the bus infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of things that are going on as it relates to infrastructure for pedestrians, bicyclists, and transit that could, you know, at some point create a more equitable transportation network and or create some mode shift in the future. But I think probably the number one issue is just I don't know that in Cleveland, it's as efficient to use transit as it may be in other cities, just because of our, you know, the congestion is really it's not there, or the density.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. You know, I don't think it is news to anyone that Cleveland and Northeast Ohio generally kind of suffers from a lot of urban sprawl. You know, lots of highways lead in way outside the urban core, which is difficult for transit. You know, that reminds me, I think it was NOACA, you know, is really looking into, you know, how are we studying roadway expansion, highway expansion in terms of, you know, what purpose does it serve outside of, you know, getting people in and out of the city as fast as we can. So I see that as an emerging trend, and that's pretty encouraging. But I see we are approaching the end of our time, and I want to be respectful of everyone here. So, you know, we talk a lot about things that we are doing or things that we're going to do in the future, and that's wonderful. And I know a lot of people are asking, well, what can I do right now? And so I'll first and foremost kind of put a little plug of one, you know, this action planning process is going to be rolling out here. Hopefully at the end of the month, we'll kick off this process. So I would really encourage people to reach out and get connected. I will post our website, you know, that we're hopefully going to populate with a lot of really good information of how you can get engaged. I would emphasize that this is not just a pedestrian and bike thing. This is an everyone thing. This is an every road user thing. And if I had my word of advice, I would say, you know, everyone slow down, look out for each other, and also start using the word crash instead of accident. You know, that's a very common Vision Zero term of accident means it wasn't preventable, and crash means it can be prevented. So Matt, Rob, any parting wisdom of what we can do right now?
I would say stay in touch with the task force. We plan on creating a website and launching those resources more publicly once we have a consultant on board to help us develop an action plan. And I think we need involvement from a broad group of people, from residents, from people in not necessarily residents of Cleveland, but also residents of our regional community, because our traffic and our activity on our roadways is regional, and it affects people locally, but that's a reality. And so I think being involved, coming to sessions like this, coming to the task force meetings, or staying connected that way, and then taking that information out to how you can be involved in your community. Again, like whether it's a capital improvement public meeting or even just a new development, right? Understanding if you live in a community where there's development going on right now in Cleveland, that's a very public process. And if you're not currently connected to that process, please reach out to me and reach out to the planning department to get connected to that process, because it's very difficult right now to connect those issues, these issues of Vision Zero, to how we're redeveloping private land. We rely on private developers to improve that space, and that's just the reality of the resources we have as a city and where we're at financially. So that's a process that shapes your built environment, whether you know it or not, and we want you to be involved, and we want you to help us be allies in advocating for the long-term changes we need to be a more sustainable city. And that's sustainable in terms of energy and sustainable in terms of sustaining lives and sustaining safety. So thank you.
Rob, I don't know if you're still with us, but if you have any parting thoughts.
I think you guys hit the nail on the head. I would just suggest if anyone sees anything that seems awkward or odd, don't hesitate to report it to the group, myself. Sometimes some of the biggest changes happen because someone just noticed something odd. And once we do our study and look into it and crash data, that we can make significant improvements. So don't hesitate to complain, I guess is the better term.
Thanks, Rob. And I would again thank you all for coming. We are very excited to kick off this process, and we are happy to answer more questions if you want to connect with us, chat more offline. We're only limited to what we can address in an hour, and frankly, I could speak all day on Vision Zero if people would let me. So we look forward to getting connected with the community and with you all and furthering this discussion, because there is a lot to discuss. I will let you all get on with your day. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you to Sustainable Cleveland for inviting us, of course, all their partners. And then I've got to give a shout out to Chief Brown and Councilman Zone for spearheading this effort and kicking this off for us. Have a good rest of your day.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. This closes out the Vision Zero breakout session. Again, just a big thanks to our presenters, Anne Tillie, Matt Moss, and Robert Mavec. Enjoy the rest of our breakout sessions. And again, a big thank you to the Cleveland Public Library for hosting all of the summit here on Hop In. So we'll see y'all soon.